Hi, Catherine.
Hi, Frank. Hi.
It's great seeing you today, even though only virtually. I'm going to quickly introduce you for
hmm
people who don't know you. You are a senior lecturer in international relations at the University of Westminster. Before that, you were a lecturer and a researcher at Queen Mary University of London, and your research interests include anti-colonial and anti-imperial perspectives on sovereignty and diplomacy. I could have read much more, but I'll keep it short. And
Yeah.
I'll put, I really wanted to talk to you today because we met about 10 days ago, and I feel like we're living in a post-truth world, post-fact world, where again, the truth doesn't really matter anymore. And the mainstream media, but also politicians, kind of, repeat a lie often enough and it becomes truth. And for me, it's very important to do the total opposite, to truly understand what's happening. And in particular, in Gaza and in Palestine, you need to look at it from a researcher point of view, from a journalistic point of view, and actually do your work before you actually, start talking about it. So I wanted to talk to you today, especially about a book you wrote in 2019 called The EU, Hamas, and the 2006 Palestinian Elections, because a lot of your focus is on international and European diplomacy with Hamas. Again, before I ask my first question, we live in a world right now, at least in Europe, where mentioning the word Hamas is already a problem. And I think that trying to understand how things happen, trying to understand how political parties or movements are born, doesn't mean you condone what they're doing. It means, it's an intellectual process that is very key to understand the world we're living in. Very long intro to say that I wanted to start in a way, not from the start, and the start would be maybe the creation of Hamas in 1987, but to the 2006 legislative elections, which happened in Palestine, in Gaza, and the West Bank. People often forget that the West Bank elections happened there too. They were internationally monitored. They were viewed as fair, transparent, and democratic by EU and US observers. But why did Hamas decide to participate in these elections in 2006?
Yeah. So first, Frank, thank you so much for having me here to talk about this topic, which of course was the topic of my doctoral research, and then of course the book that came out of that. And looking at a period in time in which there were shifts in Hamas's diplomatic engagement and what were the implications of international responses to Hamas's participation in the elections and the post-election period. So previous to the 2006 national elections, Hamas had boycotted elections, seeing them as an unjust product of the Oslo Accords, principally that the Palestinians had not managed to forge a state following the Oslo Accords, and therefore holding national elections without a state was a farce. Hamas had participated in municipal elections. It performed extremely well in the 2005 municipal elections. And it makes a decision in 2006 that it wants to seek legitimacy through the ballot box. Its participation in the Second Intifada and the use of armed struggle had not awarded the kind of sovereignty or autonomy that perhaps it and the Palestinians were looking for. So it explores a different strategy, one which might confer it international legitimacy, as well as local and regional legitimacy, offering, for example, the Palestinians an option away from Fatah and be able to vote or support Hamas. It didn't know it was going to win yet, but And Hamas had been extremely involved in supporting social services through the university, as well as the mosques in Gaza, as well as the West Bank. And so it wanted to attempt a new course of action through an engagement with the elections in 2006.
I forgot to mention that you're not saying that out of the blue. You've actually met, Hamas leaders, and you've spoken to them to try to understand why they took part in the election. And I wanted to ask you about that. So a few years after the elections, you went to Gaza and you met many people, including Hamas leaderships. And why? How did they feel? So you've mentioned that taking part in the elections was not an easy decision for them, but did they feel that it was important in a way? Did they feel any pressure in a way to take part in the elections? And what was their response a few years back when, following their victory, the blockade started?
So I traveled to Gaza, Palestine in 2012. The world looked slightly different at this particular point in time. Mohamed Morsi was in power in Egypt. It was easier to enter, so I entered through the Rafah crossing. And of course, this was part of my doctoral research. So I, sought ethical approval and conducted the research both principally in Gaza and then as well as Brussels, which we might come to. So in terms of my conversations with various levels of Hamas leadership, including senior officials, there is this desire to be recognized, and its aims to be recognized as a legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. And so in a sense, those conversations is that they wanted me to understand the efforts that they went to in order to participate in the elections, put forward a campaign. If you look at the secondary documentation around their participation in the elections, they had material relating to press freedom, to religious freedom, to the freedom of women's rights, a really encompassing political platform that they entered the elections with. So it wasn't a last minute decision. It was a really comprehensive initiative. And some of the secondary literature on this, perhaps Jerome Gunning's work, looks at the implications of engaging in a democratic process. It also socializes the movement. It gives it authority through its engagement with the institutional structures of electoral reform, for example. And I guess that comes to the point where I visited Hamas in 2012. And one of the sort of compelling takeaway points was the struggle and efforts it takes to run an administration under a blockade and under a siege. So at this time, they had been suffering from sanctions, from boycott, but also crucially, the European Union, who had been funding the civil service up until that point, very maliciously took the point to say any Fatah civil servants or any civil servants that decide to work in a Hamas administration will not receive their salaries. So even 6 years later, you still had civil servants refusing to work for the Hamas administration. So Hamas had to basically run all of Gaza from the health industry, the health sector, the education sector, with completely sort of fresh civil servants that didn't have that kind of knowledge. So really, in a sense, they also wanted to convey the struggle and effort it requires to run an administration with these limitations.
You've just mentioned the EU response to Hamas's victory, and we have to remind people that Hamas not only won in Gaza, but also won in the West Bank. Your work draws specific attention to the centrality of conditionality as the centerpiece, in a way, of the EU relations with Hamas. Could you explain what conditionality means when it comes to these relationships?
So Um, the way in which, let's say the international community, which at that time was somewhat directed by a body called the Quartet, which included the EU, the US, Russia, in order to form a response to Palestinian politics more broadly, and specifically the diplomatic track. And the EU was a significant part of that. And so this is one of the sort of critiques of EU policy, is that within 5 days of the elections, which came as a surprise to everybody, except for those that were closely monitoring it on the ground, that kind of realized if you were paying attention to the polls, you would see that Hamas was going to win. But there was the hope within EU administration, which I've been told, and it's been documented, they didn't want Hamas to win. They wanted to hold the elections, and they wanted their preferred candidate to win. And within 5 days, so really a short period of time, it's not like they held exceptional meetings that went on for days. They decide to impose a practice of conditionality on Hamas. The conditions are not completely new. There are similar things were put towards the PLO, Fatah, which included recognition of the state of Israel, renouncing all violence, and agreeing to all previous agreements reached between the parties. And so this was the policy of conditionality that was placed on Hamas. The pundits and observers at the time said that the conditions were impossible for Hamas to accept. They expected things of Hamas that ran in complete contradiction to the reasons why people voted for it. And bear in mind, as you said already, these elections were deemed to be free and fair by EU observers. And EU observers actually agreed for Hamas to participate in the elections under the name of change and reform. Right, so it wasn't a surprise that it was going to participate. My argument is also that the policy of conditionality was completely ineffectual. It didn't work, and I make this argument because European diplomats, so part of the European External Action Service, which is the highest body of European diplomacy, said to me that the conditions were not operationable. And they were not operationable because there were no benchmarks to consider whether Hamas was actually meeting any of the conditions. It wasn't like there were benchmarks that, okay, and I mean, I'm not sure if we'll come back to this question, but Hamas did offer significant compromises, for example, on the recognition of the state of Israel through 1967 borders, a significant compromise that was made. And there was no sense of, okay, it's reached this compromise, we can now decide to lift some of the sanctions, enter into negotiations. So that's what, they weren't operationable. And the second reason they weren't operationable is because there was a practice of no contact with Hamas. So it's not like European leaders or members of the quartet could meet publicly and openly and state, oh, Hamas has made compromises on some of these conditions. We can engage in further diplomatic engagement. So what I argue in the book and some of the other material that I've published is that the conditions were never meant for Hamas to be able to meet them. They were in place to legitimize the sanctioning and boycott of Hamas. And this isn't just me saying this. This is obviously those that implemented their own policies, saying these are not operational conditions for the reasons that I just mentioned.
Did the Hamas leaders, spokespersons you met understand that? And how did they understand that these conditions were never put forward to be met? And how did they feel about this? Because, listening to you, it felt like taking part in the elections was already a huge compromise. Then they released in May 2017 a document accepting a Palestinian state on the 1967 borders, which implies a recognition of the state of Israel. So as you mentioned, it looks like they made a lot of efforts towards the EU and I guess the US. So how did they feel when every time they made a step towards the EU, they were sort of pushed back in a way. What did you sort of, when you talk to them, how did they feel about that?
Yeah. I mean, this is a really important and big question, right? Especially now when we see sort of what has come about. And in some senses, you see, for example, discrediting the option or the choice to pursue constitutional legitimacy, the ballot box, diplomacy as a strategy of mediating for Palestinian sovereignty and autonomy. And so this was said to me by Ahmed Yosef, one of the Hamas leaders who was working with Ismail Haniyeh close to the time of the elections and following it, that those leaders who had put forward or encouraged, I should say, the idea of participating in the elections were discredited within the movement. That if you had been pushing for that idea that if you participate in the elections, if you form a national unity government, which maybe we'll come back to because this is a key dimension, that the European Union response will be favorable. And of course it wasn't. So in a sense, you're discrediting the option of pursuing that. And so, I mean, in a sense, they didn't give up. You know, Bassam Naim, the health minister at the time, made 2 attempts to travel to Brussels to hold conversations with the EU leaders and was removed from the plane and sent back to Egypt. So the physical incapacity of Hamas continues to make efforts across the board, including, and I'll quote this, Ismail Haniyeh, who wrote in the Washington Post in February 2006, "We are not interested in a vicious cycle of violence. If Israel withdraws to the 1967 borders, then we will establish a peace in stages." It publishes this in the Washington Post, right? That it is willing to use the 1967 borders, which is de facto recognition of the state of Israel's borders that Israel also refuses to recognize because it wants to keep its borders open so it can continue to expand. Hamas offers the 1967 borders as an agreement to work towards peace, and this is rejected as well. So in a sense, there is this sense of frustration, I think, is perhaps not a strong enough word. Complete disillusionment, really, with the international community, with the European Union, to first stand by its ideals of democratization, but also to engage with Hamas in dialogue, which is what its key members wanted. They say that we wanted to be engaged in discussion. We wanted to chart a pathway forward with other fractions in the movement.
And you mentioned the national unity government. Can you explain, because I think you're right, it's very important to understand. Can you explain why and what it was and what happened in a way?
Yeah. I'm not the only one to focus on this. Tarek Barkoni, in his excellent text, has also talked about this. And for me, the national unity government, which was reached through the Mecca Agreement following Hamas's success, is really another example of Hamas making concessions and compromises in order to fashion Palestinian governance in a way that works with the other parties and might be deemed as a better diplomatic partner, showing that it wants to engage in diplomacy. The reason it's so significant is that through the elections, Hamas formed the 10th government of the PA, Palestine. Of course, we know Palestine is not a state, but it formed the PA. And through the Mecca Agreement, it decides to withdraw some of its own members of the government, 10 in total. It gives 6 of those positions to Fatah, so the opposing party. It gives 4 of them to independent technocrats, including key ministerial positions such as finance, foreign minister, interior, and it creates an 11th government that it hopes will be regarded internationally as a better partner for peace. These are huge gestures, right? You might want to argue, oh, Hamas just participated in elections, but it's not an honest broker, which is what people might say. But those gestures that it does following the elections demonstrate its capacity to be a pragmatic political actor, which is what a lot of the secondary literature argues, and shape its own position in order to be a diplomatic partner within this. Oh, and you asked me what happened, right? Which I did. Yeah. And this is also really significant because you would, I mean, I know I have an optimist streak to me, so you would hope that this would be responded to encouragingly, especially by the European Union, who's been arguing for democratic governance within Palestine for years. And the approach that they take is the exact opposite. It, as I said before, argues that any civil servant that decides to work in this government under a Hamas leadership will not receive their salaries. It cuts off all funding to any Hamas-related projects, and it funnels it all towards Fatah. This is what the EU did. And in their own documents, which I cite in the book, they say that if we decide to support the government that did not win, Fatah, this will have an adverse effect on the question of representation and the strength of Palestinian governance. And it will also have a negative impact on our commitments to democracy. They are very aware of the implications of deciding to channel all of the money to the party that didn't win. And the UK and the US take a more draconian, perhaps, response and give Fatah weapons in Gaza to launch a coup against Hamas. So when people talk about the issues of a coordinated national government within the Palestinian movement, I mean, this is one of the reasons why, trying to fuel precisely anxiety between the groups.
Thanks, Catherine. You just spoke about no dialogue between the EU and Hamas, and the fact that Hamas leaders have tried to have a dialogue in Brussels, but were rebuffed and turned away. But you know, through your research, you've also spoken to many EU diplomats, and so I want to ask you first: were there really no discussions at all between the EU and Hamas? Because we know the US keeps saying we will not engage with Hamas, they're a terrorist organization. Mm-hmm. And by the way, I'd like to, maybe if you can remind people how many countries and institutions in the world deem that Hamas is a terrorist organization, because I think we have a very Eurocentric perspective on this. But we know that the US in Qatar talks to Hamas, or used to talk to Hamas all the time, and Israel used to talk to Hamas all the time as well. So what about the EU? Did they really not engage at all with Hamas? And what was your conversations, in a way, with EU diplomats about this, about Hamas, about the elections, and about the fact of non-engagement with them?
Yeah, this is a great question, and thank you, Frank. And as far as I know, around 9 countries have listed Hamas as a terrorist movement. Of course, it used to differ greatly between its military wing, its political wing, and this also changes over time. The EU sort of top court did remove Hamas as political wing off the terrorist list recently, and then put it back on again. According to EU regulations, to be listed as a terrorist movement does not mean that you can't have contact with the parties. So there are restrictions on funding, and there are other restrictions, but you are allowed to maintain contact. And some EU leaders were arguing that should be the practice, right, of maintaining a certain amount of negotiations. And there are some countries that did invite members of Hamas, but often these were informal, secret meetings behind closed doors. And I make the argument that by maintaining these discussions behind closed doors, it continues to reinforce this idea that Hamas are a terrorist movement, that Hamas are criminals. And in a way, it reinforces this idea that they're not legitimate partners in any form of sort of formal dialogue or discussion. But through my own conversations with European leaders, and I was specifically focused on people who had been involved in either monitoring the elections or developing a response to Hamas's success following the elections. Outwardly, they stated they know that Hamas are not dogmatic, they're not draconian, they're not particularly conservative. They're very aware that they're just another political party within the Palestinian movement. They recognized the efforts that Hamas made in terms of providing social services to the people, and they said this obviously contributed to alleviating poverty in Gaza and the West Bank. So a recognition really of the efforts that Hamas made. And also, in a sense, a real disillusionment with their own incapacity to be able to respond to this. So Lord Christopher Patten, a British diplomat, stated that the EU had every opportunity to try and engage in a more formal way with Hamas, which would have led to negotiated ways out of the stalemate at the time. And it chose a policy of sanction and siege. Quite famously, or famously for me, if you pay attention to these things, Tony Blair, who I don't typically cite, but Tony Blair published an article in The Guardian in 2017 and said that the policy of sanction and siege on Hamas was wrong. That the EU, of which he was part of, I say EU, but the European Diplomatic Corps at the time, the British Diplomatic Corps at the time, they were wrong to ignore Hamas. And this is the title of the Guardian article, right? They recognized the implications, really, of the decision to reject the diplomatic overtures that Hamas was making.
Thanks, Catherine. I'm going to ask a last question. Listening to all this, we are now more than a year into what I call a Gaza genocide. We are more than a year after a brutal attack on October the 7th by members of Hamas and also other political factions in Gaza. But listening to you, it seems like things could really have been different. Would you agree with that? And in a way, how different could it have all been?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think we have to ask ourselves this question. And rather than pose it as a kind of counterfactual, which I think people want to discredit, that there was clear evidence on behalf of both Hamas leaders saying that if you continue to strangle us, our priorities change. And this is what Ghazi Ahmed said, one of the Hamas leaders at the time, that we can't think about questions of peace and settlement because we're focused on the question of survival. We're trying to prevent people from starving in Gaza. So it states our priorities have changed. And equally, European leaders, as I've just quoted, said, if we continue to boycott and sanction Hamas, we are not going to reignite the peace process. It's impossible. They state this. It's impossible to reignite the peace process without the participation of Hamas. So people know this in advance of October 7th. And Bakoni's book, who I mentioned already, says that the state of siege and occupation and blockade, Hamas regarded this as an act of war. and despite the continuous attempts at Hamas to abide by a ceasefire, not just around the elections, but following the elections, these continued to be rejected by Israel. So in a sense, there's these continued efforts on part of Hamas to try and chart sort of diplomatic ways forward that continue to be rejected, both by Israel and, of course, the wider international community. So we do have questions of accountability, right? Who is to be held to account for this at this moment in time? And how, how could things have been different, which was the other part of your question. And I actually asked this to many of the interlocutors who I met with while I was there. And this is also published in a lot of secondary reports saying, what could have been different had the international community, the EU, the Quartet, had decided to enter into dialogue with Hamas, not to sanction and boycott it at that time. One is it would have led to a more stable governing structure within Palestinian institutions that included both Fatah and Hamas. It would have conferred a sort of constitutional legitimacy to that structure. It would have allowed those compromises that Hamas was making on the conditions, such as de facto recognition of the State of Israel through 1967 borders, to be sort of key points upon which a diplomatic chart could and should have been made. But instead, what you had is the sort of criminalization of not just Hamas, but the entire Gazan population, and perhaps more broadly, to be regarded as a hostile territory, which is Lisa Bungalia's point, and that very much that they could be exterminated, right? Because they weren't being regarded as legitimate diplomatic actors, and instead were criminalized. So there are, I think, significant questions about accountability that we need to ask ourselves. How did this environment and this political landscape ensue in which a genocide is occurring, right? And very much, I think, through not regarding the Palestinian people as full diplomatic and full political subjects, like we had the opportunity to do, and still have, I think, going forward.
Thank you, Catherine. This was very enlightening, and again, I think it's crucial to understand, to know the truth first, and to understand how, in a way, we could have avoided the massacre we're seeing live on our screens now, and how things could and maybe should have been different. So, yeah, thanks again, Catherine.
Thank you, Frank, for inviting me. Thank you very much.